first, it's fun to meet you. I feel like we've been internet friends for a really long time.
That is absolutely true. Yeah, you might not know, but I think you actually made me participate in online life a lot more than I would. I've never really got the hang of like social media, but like sometimes I looked at the things that you posted and thought, oh yeah, this is interesting. And I interacted with you and like you interacted back, which didn't happen before with like some of the people that like I don't know, you tried like somebody like Ian LeCun put something out and you interact with it and like he doesn't interact back, right? But in your case you did interact back and I say, oh, this social media thing for data science seems to be something that could work. And by interacting with you, I actually started interacting with other people like Tanya and JD Long, and like they interacted with you as well, and they started interacting with me, which ended up being like super cool. Like after seeing you in social media and interacting a little bit, I actually opened a lot of avenues for me, which made me a bigger participant in this whole environment.
Oh my gosh, thank you for telling me. I was just thinking the other day, right, with everything happening with Twitter, how much I miss those early days. At least they were early for me. I'm sure there were people on Twitter talking data science before I arrived, but I miss like there was just this fun community for a couple years that really got along and there's just like a great sense of like I loved Twitter for the longest
Right.
time. It was so much fun. And now it's just not the same. So
Yeah, it used. I remember when it used to suck. It was, what's the point of this thing, right? You just come here to lose your job. You look like you say something, and then like 3 months, like 3 hours later, you're fired. So what's the point of this? And during that time, you're right. Like it started to make sense to me, and I started to find that I could find papers that were interesting to read on Twitter. And sometimes this is a hard thing to find out, right? Which like I appreciate like your data science community, which is another place where you can find those things. But sometimes this is a problem. You have to go to conferences, you have to talk to just the right people. It is not really easy to see. And then Twitter was, people talking about new papers, and it's this seems to be a good place for that to happen. So, but for me, it sucked before, and then there was that phase that was great, the golden age of Twitter, and now, yeah, it's not the same anymore. I think it is
mm,
in a crisis mode, which is very sad. I really enjoyed it while it lasted.
yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll all come back together eventually somewhere.
If I think about my career,
Yeah.
I joined Microsoft in 2002, yes, which is 21 years ago, 20 and a half years ago. And I left Microsoft in 2020, so after 18 years, to go to Amazon. And it was a really hard decision for me when I did that, because I had that thing that you have in a broader sense. I had it for Microsoft. Because I have been at Microsoft for very long, I knew everybody who knew something about something, and there were some things I knew myself. And that it turned out to be a really valuable skill. Like I could get things done just because I knew people and I knew the people who knew the things. And at the end of the year, I looked and say, well, this is all I did, and this is everybody I connect. But it was very narrow focus on Microsoft itself. And then I left and ended up coming back. Maybe this is something that is a skill that is more valuable than I originally thought. Um, but I felt the value of being able to connect people, and how much my teams appreciated that. People would say, "Wow, you talk to Lucas. He's not going to know the answer, but he knows who knows the answer. So he's really a good person to have around." And then once you get this reputation, then a lot of people start talking to you just so that you know them, so that they can be reached out at some point, and you become this giant connector of people, which turns out to be super valuable, right? And I see you being this connector of people in data science and social media and online. And, like I was a little bit at Microsoft for a while, which was a very fun thing to be.
Yeah, it can be a lot of fun because you get to have a lot of fun You learn so much. I assume you're probably a lot like me in this, and that like you just love learning. And
Right.
so when you talk to people from all kinds of, I mean, even within an organization, everybody's, especially of the size of Microsoft, right? Everybody's doing something different, and you can learn about their job, you can learn about their hobbies. Um, yeah, and it's just fun to learn, and then you retain it and then get to put people together, which is always fun.
But one thing I found, especially about myself when I leaned into this role, is that my learning was mostly superficial. I knew
Mm,
about things, but I was not a specialist of many things. And it really takes, and it is a role that I really enjoy, to be a generalist and know about things but not know details. And it takes me effort. I find that it takes me a lot of effort to actually be a specialist into something. And I really need to think, like, to plan, oh, I'm going to be a specialist on this specific subfield of this subfield. And then I need to plan on how to learn, because left to my own devices, I would probably just like learn superficially about what people are doing and understand how it connects to other things, and um, use that knowledge to connect people and connect things, and get things done, rather than be specialists. But our market tends to reward specialization quite a lot. And at some point in my career, I thought, well, this might be holding me back. I think there is not a like it is not obvious to people how this connectivity role is important and valuable, and it is very clear to people that a specialization is valuable. So I think people who are specialists get better rewards than people that are generalists.
yeah, I mean, that's such a great description. I'm definitely more, it's hard to be a specialist. I definitely love being a generalist and being able to do a little bit of everything. What is something you're working on being a specialist in right now?
Yeah, so like it goes from like from a broader sense is NLP, but is very narrowed into being a specialist in disinformation and how to detect intent from language.
Mm,
And this is what I have been studying quite a lot, because I'm working in projects that require having to know that. And this is like, if I have to read a paper, if I have to read 10 papers, I'm gonna read a lot of papers about that, rather than reading papers about other things that say, oh, this sounds really interesting. So let me read more about that and say, well, but before I do that, let me make sure that I read at least one more thing about disinformation or NLP
mhm.
or intent on communication, or how to classify intent of text, how to detect plagiarism, this kind of thing where that you can use to find how people are using computers to spread disinformation.
I completely empathize with what you're saying because yes, I at one point this weekend was like, "Oh, I could build out a Shiny app to collect all the movies and TV shows I want. And then I could build a database, and then I could build my own Rexis, to find like new shows." I don't have any I've never built a recommendation system, but it was one of those like, "Oh, that would be a fun project." And then it was like I had to take this moment of like, "Okay, how does that help me?" Like is that am I procrastinating doing something that I need to be more specialized in? Like where does that all fall? So how do you like disinformation, especially with NLP, like that is very specialized. How do you set up like how are you setting up your learning?
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is where the connector role
Mm,
that I had before helps a lot. I don't think you need a PhD to be a specialist on that, although it helps you be recognized as a specialist of that if you have one.
mm,
But I get the ability. I have a position that allows me to talk to the PhDs and get paper recommendations from them and self-study from that. Um, it is a little bit related with age and where my life is now. I think if I was younger and had a lot of time, getting the PhD would actually take me there faster. But I have a lot of like it would be hard to carve the time that is needed to do the PhD in my day to day. So in order to function and deliver the stuff I need to do. I actually have like one of my work colleagues is a linguistics PhD, and we talk to each other a lot. And another one is a cybersecurity PhD that is whose speciality is defense operations. And then I talk to her a lot, and this is how I lean into their knowledge to build my own knowledge. But it is a lot of self study at this point.
Mhm.
And I think over the course of one's career, self study becomes very important because you get a degree, but you get a degree usually before you're 30. And like I did my own graduate degree when I was older than that. But after that, it's like you cannot keep getting degrees. It takes a lot of time and effort, right? So you need to kind of optimize on how you're going to collect this information and talking to people and finding out how they learn and where they learn from. I think is a great way that works really well for me.
Yeah, that's such a great point about knowing who knows what, and then starting those conversations and kind of having that knowledge exchange to help you with the self-study, because you can't, I mean, I don't know, that would be kind of fun. I guess if I were independently wealthy, I would just go to school all
Yeah,
the time.
right.
I mean, forget vacation. I mean, maybe I'd take vacations and stuff, but I feel like that's what I would do. I would just get degree after degree just to, or just like be a perpetual student. That's, I think that's my safe place, is being in school. I love being in school. So,
Yeah, it is. It is. It is a consumption good. Like I studied finance, and
Mhm.
finance is economics with like a specialization in finance. And one of my favorite people there, a professor named Ed Rice, he said, like people buy education not because they want to get better at it, but also because it's entertaining. It's people like doing that, right? It is like some for a lot of people, instead of watching Netflix, they go to school and it's fun and they should be fun. And I completely saw myself on that. And like there is that question that I saw in some movie that I don't remember anymore. It might have been Clerks. What would you do if you had $1 million, right? And like I would probably do what you just said. I would like go back to school and study a lot. People experience life in different countries in different ways, and sometimes our culture makes us think about some problems in the way that our culture solves those problems. But by seeing different cultures, you see that there are very different ways of thinking and solving those problems. And I think this equips you with diversity in
Mhm.
problem solving, which is very, very useful and also very useful to connect people. You see that there is more to that. I at some point in my life I managed contact centers for Microsoft, which is interesting experience by itself. And one of the biggest problems that we had was to explain to people in contact centers how life worked in different
Mm.
countries, because it is not uncommon that people in contact centers will support people from other countries. Like a very common one is like India and Manila and Philippines supporting the United States in English, but also in several countries that speak Spanish.
Mm.
Usually, this support comes from a single country. And countries do stuff in different ways. So, for example, one thing that usually trips up uh, call center people in different countries in countries that are not the United States, it's about checks. Like you start talking about checks. Oh, I just send a check. Can I just send a check? And the United States seems to be kind of the last place where people use checks in their day to day, or used to use checks in their day to day. Other countries, what is a check, right? Why they're talking about checks? My grandmother used to use checks, but we use electronic payments for a long time, right? Why is this person talking about this? They just don't know how life works, so it's hard for them
Yeah.
to understand the other side.
Yeah. It had never even occurred to me that checks weren't common in the
Right.
world, right? I think I still have to wrap my head around that the credit score in the United States started in like the 1980s and is not an international thing. There is, yeah, I mean, there's so much. So a trip that I took right before the pandemic, I went to Cuba,
Mhm.
and which I loved. I wanted to go back, and then the pandemic happened. But it was, I was like feeling really confident, like learning about data science and how people in different countries are practicing data science. And I thought I had this really well developed view. And, I was always like, oh, well, all you really need is a computer and an internet connect. Like anybody can learn data science. Right. And then I go to Cuba and I'm like, oh, like unless you're in a university, you have to, one, getting a computer is hard. Two, you have to purchase internet time you have to get these cards for internet, and then there are places without internet. And I was like, so data science isn't available to, it's not as easy as I had thought. And so having, again, another experience where I was like, I started thinking a lot about how do you, like, if someone wanted to learn data science without like, could you do it without a computer? Like, could you teach programming by paper, and kind of correspondence and things like that? So yeah, it definitely got me thinking about the problem solving and the way that we communicate. And I think a lot of the expectations we have, especially in the United States, of just how easy some things can be.
Yeah, this sparks so many things into me. So me talk a little bit about something that is related to the lab I work in.
Yeah.
We have a project about digital literacy, and and the other thing that is related to that is what Angela Bassa, that is Brazilian as well, talks about what is the ground truth, and specifically that data is not the ground truth, and those two things are going to come together in an interesting way. So in the United States, there is something called availability of broadband that is measured by the government, like what percentage of the population has broadband available to them. And the numbers are really high, like, oh, 80%, 90%, 95%. And you go county by county, and most counties are over 90%. But that's where Angela's insight about, like data is not ground truth is comes into play. So what does this 95% means? What does available mean? And and then you start to see that it's really subtle. Sometimes it means it's available in the city where the county, in the major city of the county. So somebody could actually go there in a library and get broadband. But that doesn't mean it's a practical matter. Like some people are
Mhm.
going to live an hour away from that, and it's going to be hard for them to actually get to that. So we started measuring broadband using Windows telemetry. So because most people have Windows computers, this
Yeah.
is still a very commonplace. And this is something that some people allow us to get this telemetry. What is the actual speed that they are getting in their computers? Then we have an alternative metric of how much broadband is available to actual people. And it's like a gigantic gap. And you see, like the more remote counties,
Mhm.
you look at the government data and say, oh, it's 98% broadband availability, and in practice is like 35%. And this allows you to see, and this actually makes a big difference on how people implement government policies. When somebody in the government might think, oh, you just like feel this, you watch this video on like you watch this video online that teaches you how to fill this form that allows you to get this specific benefit, and 98% of people have access to broadband, so it's going to be easy for you to watch this video. And it turns out that in that county is 35% people actually have broadband, and their broadband is, I don't know, 128 megabits, right? So it is not actually, might not even be enough for them to get to actually do what they are thinking about doing. So I thought this experiment was very interesting about digital literacy. um, that what we expect people have is not exactly what they have, and actually measuring this in a different way teaches us uh, what reality, where reality really is, and what is the gap that we need to cross in order to make it better for everybody. And then we started giving this to governments, and of course, governments are very interested in this, and then they do their own initiatives to actually increase our measure rather than the FTC measure,
Yeah.
and then this becomes a lot better for everybody who actually gets to interact with the government digitally.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point because I mean, because even in the US, there are places where you, one, can't access internet, and two, if you can access internet, the quality is pretty poor. And I feel like there was an uptick of awareness around that when everything started to go remote, especially with
Right,
schools. And it was like, oh, we'll just do classes on Zoom. And that isn't, it's not nothing is ever just, right? It's not
right.
just, oh, we'll just go to Zoom. It's not uncommon for a household to have one computer, but what if you have three kids who are all attending remotely, right? And you do get into more resource constraints. And I love that idea of how we measure something is going to affect like our perception of it, right? And the reality of it. And so just because it's been measured and we're getting 98% coverage doesn't mean it's actually 98% coverage.
Right. Yeah, and the other part for me was the credit score.
Oof.
A lot of my work in at Microsoft was about credit, but that's not credit score for consumers. It was credit score for companies because most companies they sell on credit. Like you get the product, and when companies sell to companies, they usually sell on credit. You get the product and then you pay later an invoice, especially if it is a big invoice. And so I have worked with credit for a fair part of my life. And one thing I realize in credit is that people have different definitions of what credit success is. And sometimes those definitions are not like how can I say, homogenized before people start making decisions on them. Like for a long time in a place I worked on, uh, there was there were two different definitions of what was a credit failure. One was that the person paid something late, and the other was that the person went bankrupt and didn't pay at all. And there is an intersection between those two things. Like if the person doesn't pay at all, they definitely paid late, right? It's definitely going to be they're going to be past due on their bills. So there
Mhm.
is an intersection on those. But what you do and when you do things is very different depending on the definition that you are using. And you look at the data, and the data is was this a credit fail or not? But it didn't explain what type of failure it was. So a lot of the data was being collected with different definitions depending on who was collecting and how they were collecting. And in that column in the database, you only see zeros and ones, but each zero and each one, they mean something completely different.
Yeah.
And homogenizing that was like a really big job. And once we kind of understood how things should be measured and started collecting the data properly, and then we started making better decisions. But it took a while to even to understand that people were talking about different things and giving it the same name.
Yeah, and that kind of comes back to that idea of being a connector, right? You could have just looked at the database and said, "Great, we have everything." But as you talk to people, you start to realize that maybe we don't have the same definitions, or maybe this person is, entering this value under this condition, but someone else, yeah, kind of starting to normalize your raters in a way.
Right, and this is why this connector work I think is so important. If you don't have somebody who is a connector that talks to people and gets them to explain things, you might not even understand that you have this problem, and then you implement like a giant, expensive machine learning system that detects something, and it detects the wrong thing because it's like have crappy data coming in, and you do know. And then there is this guy that talks to people and realizes, oh, this is wrong, and you just should like have two different fields, and one means pay late and the other means didn't pay at all. And then people think, oh, this is easy, right? Like, oh yeah, it's obvious, and like everybody could do this. And while I think it's true that it's not really hard,
Mm,
being in the position of realizing that and talking to enough people to realize that that is a problem, it is a real skill that I think is underpaid in our current high-tech environment where people get paid for specialization,
mm,
very heavily for specialization. Somebody who tweaks XGBoost a little bit and gets zero point zero 0.01 more precision in something is going to get paid a lot better than this person that actually solved the
mm,
problem that XGBoost is going to be used later. and probably got 10 points out of performance by just talking to people. And like the specialist is going to probably be paid a lot better than this person that is just talking to other people.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting because it's people who do connection work and talk to people. It's not something you can measure, right? It's not like you sit down and say, okay, today here's a list of the 10 people I'm going to talk to and the questions I'm going to ask them. And then these were the results. I don't know how it's happened for you. In my experience, it's a lot of random conversations, right? A meeting is over and a couple of us have stayed late to chat, or back in the office days, passing someone in the hallway and having a off the cuff conversation and just learning a little bit more about what they're doing. How do you go about, like, I guess what I'm getting at is if someone's like listening to this and they're like, I can see the value in being a connector, but I'm very focused on code. Like, what advice do you have for someone to maybe how does someone go about being a little bit more of a connector?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was thinking about this too, and I was thinking a little bit about how asking you the same question, but I have an answer for it. I think when you start connecting people, it is a lot more art than science, but you start getting down to a science over time. And I want to hear your perspective
Yeah.
on this. But I see like over time, you have like better defined objectives, who I'm going to talk to about what, and what is the objective of having that conversation, and etc. To answer your question, in my specific case, it was very random in the beginning, but at some point I started putting some structure into it. And what are the things I know and what are the things I don't know?
Mm,
And for the things I don't know, what are the things that I want to learn and what are the things that I just want to know who knows about them? And sometimes it's because they are not interesting to me, and sometimes is because I don't have the background to actually learn
mm,
deeply about them. But when you start doing these intersections of things I need to know and things I can know about, it starts to become clearer to me, like how to learn about those things. And sometimes the answer is I'm actually going to study them, and sometimes I'm going to find somebody who knows about those things so I can ask questions about that. But it all starts from like a major strategy.
mm,
So in this role, I mean, what are the things that I need to know about? And then for each one of them, and I'm really going to go deep and I'm going to know about who knows about this, and I'm just going to have a very superficial, like high level learning so I can just ask questions about that. And over time, I think you build better maps of those things. And as you do this for a long time, your maps get really rich. So if you need to learn about something, you already have a lot of information about where to go for. One question that I found that was very interesting to ask people when I was trying to learn about what they knew was, how is their success measured
mm,
in their role? And this allowed me to interpret their answers a lot better as well. So for somebody who is, let's say, somebody who detects fraud through NLP, by like reading reviews, like creating machine learning systems that read reviews and detect whether people are saying that the seller is a good seller or a bad seller. And they are measured about the success rate of reading a review and figuring out whether that seller that got that review was fraudulent or not.
mm,
And because they have to be good at that to be successful, by learning that this is their objective, I learn a lot of what they need to know in order to be successful. And then I know what questions to ask them, and I know how to take more, to be more efficient in using their time because I know what is important to them.
mm. I think we go about this differently. So, which is totally fine. But the thing you said that really resonated with me was this idea of a map. And that's when, like, all of a sudden, like, my brain clicked, all these things clicked into place for me. And I think I have a very self-centered map, right? Like in my map in my head, I'm in the center. It's my life. Like I'm allowed to be the hero of my own story. But I have this belief that everybody is interesting, right? Every person out there is interesting in some way. And so I used to be really, really shy. And I made it my goal, right? Whenever I interacted with someone, to try to find something interesting about them, to get them to share a story or something that I could pull on that seemed like something they're passionate about or interesting, interested in, or a hobby, or anything like that. And I think I've internalized a lot of that, but then I connect it, right? For people who are maybe a little shy, I think one of the things is, yes, it's okay to have questions ahead of time, like to practice asking your questions, but to also be comfortable with silence. I found that if you can wait 2 to 3 seconds, someone will usually keep talking and
Yeah,
they'll tell you more.
that's true. My map has a trick which that I think is very useful. That is when I write the definition of something, and I'm pretending I have like a physical map, but and I'm actually writing things on it, but it's all in my head, which is kind of sad. But like, oh, let's pretend it's a physical map that I write things on it. I'm also in the center of it, by the way.
Yeah.
But when I write things on definitions on my map, I write definitions of how things are used instead
Mm,
of what things are. So if you think about an axe, a definition of an axe would be, like a blade with like a wood thing attached to it.
yeah.
And for me, that's not the definition of an axe. It's something that I can use to chop a tree. So I think about my map. I write definitions about how things are used
Yeah.
rather than how things are. And that tends to help me in so many things because when somebody comes to me with a problem, I know lots of things that can be used to solve that problem.
Mhm.
And because that's how I build my map and how I think about things. Anyways,
Yeah.
I thought that at some point I started doing that, and I thought it made things a lot easier to keep track of.
Well, and it's such I mean, I think it probably also makes you a great problem solver, because if you think about something, right, not in terms of what it does. So a model, right? Like you could have a whole list of models and what they are, but knowing what they do lets you apply them to different situations, and even I think get really creative, right? There are things where you want to I can't come up with good examples off the top of my head, but like you want to accomplish a task or solve a problem, and you could take something from what you know about carpentry and what you know about data science and maybe what you know about project management, and somehow those how those things work and like the different functions combine to solve your problem.
This actually really works really well for me in the way that you explain. The way I solve problems is by connecting different things that I know about from other people or that I learned myself. And because the way I store things in my head is what they do, I say, well, I get this piece that does that, and that fits this other piece that does this other thing, and that fits this other piece that does this other thing. So by connecting them in a system, I get the solution to the problem that I want to really solve.
Mhm.
And a lot of those things are off the shelf. So I'm in my teams. I'm usually the person who does the off-the-shelf proof of concept for the first solution of most problems. And it turns out that this has been very helpful for my career because there are lots of those proof of concept solutions that are still in production, right? So nobody actually ever came with something better. And now you get this like package here and this other package here, and you join them together in this fancy way, and this solves the problem for now. And this now has been running for several years. There is a system that I built that I know of that has been running since 2000.
Oh my gosh.
And one of these days I say, well, they actually has a new UI on top of it. And when I saw the new UI, it's been a few years ago. I saw the new UI. I said, "Oh, they finally replaced that. I don't have to like remember about the system anymore." And then I started clicking around, and I say, "Oh no, it's just like a shell on top of the solution." But the solution is still the solution that I built in the year 2000. Anyway, so it turns out that this is a useful way to keep things in your head.
For career advice, I think that's great career advice, right? You don't have to build the most beautiful, perfect, polished thing. Like sometimes that off the shelf proof of concept thing you'll work faster, you'll produce faster, and sometimes that is also the final product for so many people.
Yeah, I find that this is a place where, in practice, I see a lot of data scientists failing in a very specific way, that they
Mm,
try to apply complicated techniques to simple problems without actually building the baseline model first.
mhm.
And sometimes the solution to the problem is already of resolved by the baseline solution. And I've seen this happen in very funny ways. I've seen one problem that, and that is a story that I think exemplifies this perfectly. So there was this thing that somebody needed to do, that they needed to forecast some financial number, and they hired a consulting company of data scientists, and they came and they built a machine learning model to predict that particular financial number. And the process that existed before was essentially a guy guessing, and the guy guessed it right like 30% of the time. And the consulting company came with machine learning, and they started guessing 45% of the time correctly. So it was like a 15-point improvement, and everybody celebrated and hey, yay. And then they were talking to the problem to me at some point, like that connector role coming into place. And I say, "Oh, you guys like just tried using like the Excel forecasting function on the data. It's not a lot of data. It seems like the data is pretty forecastable. And you just drag this and you get that." And it turned out that the Excel forecasting function for that particular problem would actually forecast things 95% correctly. And it took me like a minute to solve that. And people started using, but that Excel solution was never published because
Yeah.
like nobody wants to talk about that. People wanted to talk about data science and like using machine learning to solve problems. But now the baseline solution that somebody could have done and saved people a lot of trouble is, oh, could we actually just use the ZTS forecast function in Excel and see whether it will actually forecast the next financial number properly? That would have taken them 10 minutes and would have solved the problem. So, and I see people doing this particular different versions of this thing of, oh, let me throw a lot of data science into things to solve this problem before thinking about a baseline solution very frequently. It is probably in my career the thing I saw the most. I
Mm.
come into a project late, like I'm in the middle of a project, and when I get in, I ask, oh, what is the baseline solution? And it doesn't exist. And I say, you could do something simple. It's like, oh, Excel file, or like just a basic XGBoost that you just like feed the data directly into it. Did somebody do that? And nobody ever did it. And that's usually one of the first things I do when I join a project in the middle, is to build the baseline solution, which should not be the thing. That should already exist, but it frequently does not.
Sometimes, yeah, it seems like sometimes we like to over engineer. We like to use our shiny new toys, our fancy tools, and sometimes the problem just needs counts and percentages. Um,
Right,
just
it's true. Yeah, yeah. It's like maybe there is this Randy. Oh, I think his newsletter is something like counting things, and yeah, I had this career advice from a person who was a consultant at BCG. He said, like the work that you're gonna do in your life is going to be averaging things and de-averaging things. If somebody already took an average, there's usually an opportunity to break that average into subcomponents, and you're going to learn something about that. And if nobody did take an average, just take the average of everything, and that's what you do. And you do that 80% of the time is a lot more than everybody else did. Then it's true. Yeah, and it could be like that's a perfect baseline solution that people don't use. Like just take the average of things, right? And see what that gives you. And sometimes I get into a project and there are people doing like deep learning and they didn't take the average yet.